the worst ratios on the planet, yet we contend that we are the leaders in democracy. It's all a lie. But what I'm about to tell you is the worst lie of all. Like everyone else, I believed what I was taught in school. I believe my teachers knew what they were talking about, and I believe they thought they knew what they were talking about. And when I was in law school, I said, I'm aware of this article, the first thing, because most people, if I were to ask you about the Bill of Rights, because at the end of the day, there were 12 proposals that Congress passed on to the states. Now, I'm not making this up. I'm going to pass around the room, because I'm going to wait till I explain the process. There were 12 proposals, not 10. Okay? Because the warm and fuzzy history we're taught in school today is, everyone agreed to the Constitution, and then they said, we should have these 10 amendments that are the Bill of Rights, and all 13 states ratified them, and isn't that cool? Isn't that nice? Let's all smile. The only problem with that is it's an absolute lie. Now, starting from the onset, there were 12 proposals. What we today call the First Amendment was actually the third. It wasn't the first most important. It wasn't the second most important. It was the third most important. The first most important was the guarantee of representation in Article the First. And in fact, it was put first because it was the most important. Because if you don't have fair and adequate representation in your government, everything else is an illusion. It's window dressing. There's a line I have to say, don't pee on my head and tell me it's champagne. I know the difference. Okay? And what's occurring today is pretty akin to that. So the amendment process starts, and Congress passes these 12 amendments through this legislative process. Congress, the House originally wants 18, the Senate reduces it to 12, they are disagreeing, they have a committee that meets, they finally agree upon them. The last 2 days as Congress is going out of session, this was the least important thing on the members of Congress's mind. They were trying to form a judiciary, they were trying to form the executive departments, the Department of Foreign Affairs that ultimately became the Department of State, the Treasury Department, the Department of War, have an Attorney General. Those were viewed as pretty important, and more important than let's tamper with the document that we haven't even gotten off the ground yet. But Madison made his campaign promise, and he delivered. So you have to know how things develop. Because again, 95% right makes you 5% wrong. If you know how it developed, you know where everything went wrong. But first I'm going to do the count, and I'm going to go back and tell you how everything went wrong. Before I do that, I'm going to explain how we teach it wrong today. Now, that's why I wrote these books. These books are rare. They're also the books you will find in the United States Supreme Court, the U.S. Attorney General's office, and every good law library in the nation. Because if you have a question about the Bill of Rights, so to speak, you will go to a 2-volume treatise printed and published by Macmillan Company in 1971 with the author, or the chief editor, being Professor Bernard Schwartz of New York University School of Law. Pretty impressive place. When I was young, he was one of my people that I looked up to because he studied the same stuff that I did. I read everything that he wrote. So when I was in law school, I thought, I've always taken it on faith. I'm always told, because unlike other people, I knew that there were 12 proposals, not 10. I said, I've never seen for myself that these first two really didn't get ratified. So I went back, and of course I went to Professor Bernard Schwartz's book, which is what was available to me. At that time I had not gone into the National Archives in Washington as I have since done. I went to the various state archives as I have since done. And I believed it as true. And at page 1203, Professor Bernard Schwartz, which I'm going to pass this book around, look at it yourself, because this is the book the United States Supreme Court itself relies upon. And it's wrong. And it's even worse. Okay? Page 1203, there's a chart. And he tells, when he say he, I'm talking about Professor Bernard Schwartz on page 1203, the chart that everyone relies upon since 1971 says that Pennsylvania did not ratify Article the First, and Delaware did not ratify Article the First. Okay? So that means that 9 out of 13 states, because what we also don't talk about is, at the time, Connecticut, Georgia, and Massachusetts never reported any ratification. And how do we know that? Well, because Thomas Jefferson, and of course, once again, the devil's in the detail. According to the National Archives, this is Thomas Jefferson's ratification chart. Although the reality is it was probably prepared by either Henry Remsen or Roger Alden, his clerk. But it's attributed to Jefferson because it came out of his office. This is the actual chart where he kept track, kept count. Because someone's got to keep count. Because the Constitution's Article 5 says, once an amendment is proposed, it is valid for all intents and purposes when ratified. It doesn't say when ratified and people tap their head and do a dance. It doesn't say when ratified and some other further action is taken. And the reason why they did that is because it's a numbers question. You don't want to have someone that can frustrate the process by saying, no, we're not going to acknowledge this. But this is Jefferson's chart. Now, interestingly enough, Jefferson had Pennsylvania's ratifying article first, which Professor Schwartz says never happened. And Jefferson's chart also has New Hampshire's ratifying article second, which Professor Schwartz says never happened. Now, Jefferson was a pretty smart guy. And on the same page, in addition to this chart, there's a footnote. Because everyone always talks about, oh, well, when were the Bill of Rights deemed ratified? And there was a footnote by Professor Schwartz, and I'm going to pass it around so you can look at it yourselves. And it's an answer. It says, first, and he quotes, he says, the amendments were ratified and declared ratified by Thomas Jefferson in a letter to the states in February 1792. And he cites, it says, first things first, Harper's Magazine, June 1963, page 43. This letter, officially announcing the ratification of the Bill of Rights, was sent by Jefferson as Secretary of State to the governors of the several states. So I'm like, wow, so that's the answer. So Jefferson sent this letter saying they were ratified. The only problem with that is it's a lie. Yeah. I'm going to pass around with the book. You can't make this up. I'm going to pass around with the book, page 43 from the 1963 Harper's Magazine. Let me read you the epic letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote that is referred to as the determinative document that determined and declared that the Bill of Rights were ratified. To the governors of several states, Philadelphia, March 1, 1792. Sir, and this was what was called a form letter sent to all governors of the then 14 states, because now by that point you had Vermont. Sir, I have the honor to send you herein enclosed 2 copies duly authenticated of an act concerning certain fisheries of the United States. Okay. And for the regulation and government of the fishermen employed therein. Also an act to establish the post office and post roads within the United States. And also the ratifications by 3/4 of the legislatures of several states of certain articles in addition to an amendment of the Constitution of the United States proposed by Congress to the said legislatures and of being with sentiments of the most proper and perfect respect, Your Excellencies, Thomas Jefferson. Okay. First of all, he talks about fishing. And he says, oh, and by the way, here's some information about ratifications. He didn't declare anything, okay? Look at it yourselves. See if you think that that is a declaration, because it's not, okay? And it says, and a footnote here, letter by which Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson notified the governors of the states of the ratification of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and it's reprinted from a memo by Helen Hill Miller, Harper's Magazine, June 1963. So Helen Hill Miller, who was a George Mason scholar in 1930s and 40s and 50s, she passed away in like 1994. Her papers are at Harvard, and that memo was not there. But she wrote a memo that no one seems to know where it is, and she took the position that she thought that this letter was epic and that it affected, and that was the declaration. But this is a cover letter. So one would think you'd want to read what was enclosed in the letter, which I will pass around to you as well.
Yep.
Which I got out of the archives. And this is a printing. This is the Library of Congress's copy from the archives. You can read it, and more importantly, number one, Pennsylvania is included as ratifying Article 1st. New Hampshire is included as ratifying Article 2nd. And nowhere in here does he declare anything. He just says, oh, here's the stuff, here's the information we have so far. And by the way, that's an afterthought in a letter about fisheries. So this is what is cited to in history, relied upon by the Attorney General, the Supreme Court, and it's a footnote that cites to a magazine, that cites to an unpublished article, that relies upon a letter that is a cover letter and doesn't have the enclosure. Now again, they thought that they had something great, and all I did was go to the Department of State documents and quickly was able to find the letter. It's not, and all it is, it's a cover letter. It's in here also. So if you take the cover letter, you'd think you'd want to see what the enclosure is. So now we get debunked that Professor Schwartz has been lying to us, and everyone's been believing it is true since 1971 when people have been paying attention. It gets worse. Professor Bernard Schwartz, I don't want to use the word plagiarized, but we all went to grammar school, I assume. And I'm not casting aspersions because I never cheated in school. I was the one that everyone wanted to cheat on, cheat off of. You don't cheat off the kid that gets the 40 on a math test. You want to cheat off someone who knows the answers. Well, Professor Bernard Schwartz, I'm going to pass around. Here's his chart. Okay. The only problem is it's not even his chart. Professor Bernard Schwartz plagiarized a chart from 1844 from this book, which I'm going to pass around. Now, if only you would know. People can say a lot about me, but they cannot criticize my credentials as a scholar. Let me pass this around because first, I want you to take a look at this stuff. You're all pretty smart people. Compare this chart, right, sir, with this chart. Now, are they similar or are they identical? It's a leading question.
Okay.
Can you say that louder?
Wow.
Say it one more time.
Wow.
Now, pass these around. Compare the two. Compare the two.
Exactly the same.
So someone made a mistake. Huh? No, he didn't even footnote it. You know how I found it? You know how I caught him?
No.
It's the best part. In 1971, he had this book come out. He got paid a lot of money. And everyone in history believes it's true.
Every law student has this book.
And so then 7 years later, he wrote another book. Because you make money in writings,
Yeah.
even when you're wrong. And so in that book, he talks about the great rights of mankind. He tells a warm, fuzzy story about the Bill of Rights, which is not really true. Okay. And he's factually inaccurate, got paid a lot of money, it was published by, what was it? Let's see, not being sarcastic here, but Oxford University Press. Wasn't self-published on the web. And when you go to the page where he says, when you go to the page where he says, and cites to, and this is where Thomas Jefferson declared blah, 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 because he essentially cites his own bad homework as truth for that. He also footnotes for the first time, 7 years later, this book in a footnote. Compare the name of this book with the name of that book when you get a chance. I'll save you time, it's the same.
No.
Okay. So the point is, I guess, I don't know whether he was under a deadline or whatever, but he took inaccurate information and published it as if it was true, and everyone relies upon it as if it was true. Now,
Sounds like the government.
huh?
Sounds like the government.
Well, rules only apply if you want them to. Yeah, I'm going to ask Congress's permission to bomb Syria. Oh, if they say no, I'm going to do it anyway. Okay, well, what's the Constitution for? I guess we're all here as a bunch of jokesters to do whatever you want. But if you had one for every 50,000 people in Congress, that wouldn't be the case. But I'll get back to that. So let me explain how Article the First got lost, deep six, and hid in history. Because let's take the chart first. And let me explain the Constitution's Article 5's amendment process. Remember how I explained that an amendment is ratified when, it becomes law when ratified. Now, when ratified means when the legislatures of 3/4 of the states have given their affirmative vote and their assent. Now, it gets even more specific because even though the text of the Constitution's Article 5 is pretty clear, because say you vote on a Tuesday and the clerk doesn't get around to doing the resolution until the following Wednesday, a week to 8 days later. Well, then what day did the state legislature vote? Well, according to the Constitution's clear meaning, it's when ratified, meaning when they voted. Because the Article 5 process is a hybrid constitutional federal lawmaking process. So the vote is not really subject to the rules of the state legislature in making state laws. All you need is each house to affirmatively vote, thumbs up yes. That's it, nothing more. The resolution memorializing that action is largely irrelevant. All it does is confirm the date. And in fact, the Supreme Court has ordered, starting in the 20s, that if it becomes an issue, courts, Article III courts, federal courts, are directed to take judicial notice of when amendments were ratified by reference to the legislative journals of each state. Meaning, the day is when they vote, not the day when they get around to telling you that they voted. Okay? And many times they forget to vote. And people don't pay attention, and then things get lost in history. Now, let's start with Thomas Jefferson's chart. Thomas Jefferson was not authorized under the Constitution to promulgate anything, to declare anything, so he didn't. He never did. And I think I've made that pretty clear now, that that's a myth, and it's not the truth. And by the way, the Attorney General's office agrees with me. Congress agrees with me. In fact, if you go back, there was printing the Constitution in 1934, after they repealed Prohibition, and even back then they're talking about, yeah, you know, there never was any promulgation of the first 10 amendments, and you know, we don't have any information about Connecticut, Georgia, or Massachusetts. So once I found that, I was like, geez, you know, Schwartz is wrong. I believe he was right for years. What am I, an idiot? Apparently so. I drink the Kool-Aid. So what did I do? I went back into the archives of Connecticut, Kentucky, and Georgia to determine whether or not, by any weird quirk of history, that the legislatures had in fact affirmatively ratified Article the First, or any of the amendments, and just never got around to reporting it. Now before I do that, let me explain the context of the Prohibition case, because this is very significant. In a case called Dillon versus Gloss, in the mid-30s, in the early 20s, when they first enacted Prohibition, the 19th Amendment said, a year from the day that it's ratified, it's illegal to sell, dispense, consume, blah, 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 alcohol, okay? A guy by the name of Gloss was a bootlegger, and he got caught. And he said, wait a second, the threshold state at that point had ratified like on one date, and he had been caught a year after, between the time when the state legislature had ratified and when they actually got around to preparing a resolution. So the question in that case is, when did the amendment become operative? And the Supreme Court, not making law, but just reading what the Constitution said, no, it's ratified, it's law when ratified in this federal constitutional lawmaking process. So we already know who is on record and what is on record with regard to what amendments have been ratified. But before I show you something, let me show you the next thing. 100 years in, we have the centennial celebration of the Constitution in this country. And it's kind of a big event. It's like the bicentennial is a big event. And so there's all these commissions, and everyone starts studying the Constitution, and they're all excited about it. So the Department of State decides for the first time to make public information about the ratifications dealing with the Constitution. So they issue what starts out as a 2-volume set in 1894, which is expanded to 3 volumes in 1904, and then volumes 4 and 5 in 1905. The key to this story is volume 2, issued in 1894, of which I'm going to show you.
The actual copy.
100 years in, before the Supreme Court used the 14th Amendment to even make the Bill of Rights applicable to the states, which didn't occur until the 20s, they list all the ratifications that were on record as having been received by the President and Congress. And I will save you time to say that what is in this book matches what Jefferson printed in that pamphlet and sent to the states. But what is in this book also is a note, not a declaration by a member. This is essentially a note by some editor that's an employee of the Department of State in 1894. And at the end of this, he says on page 390, which I will pass around to you, so you can see for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Because when you tell people this story, they're like, oh, that's another Obama birth certificate thing. That's a lot of hooey. It's not true. Don't believe it. Don't listen to them. Listen to your own eyes, okay? On page 390 of this rather rare book, because again, in a country at the time where they had About 120 million people at that time. They printed a whopping 7,000 copies. So even today, this is not an easy book to find. Okay. But this also happens to be an accurate reprint. And let me preface this by saying, I didn't rely upon this. I went to the National Archives with my research privileges, which are not that easy to get. They don't give them to everyone, at least to look at the stuff I do. And I have, which I didn't bring here tonight because it's very hard to read, I have digitized copies of the handwritten ratifications from every state. So when I tell you that this is accurate, I went to the source every time. Because the one thing that you'll learn about me is if I say something is true, it's not because I'm arrogant. I don't go on record unless I'm sure. Not 95% sure, 100% sure. Now, let me read you this footnote written by some clerk in 1894. After talking about the ratifications on record, it says, note, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution proposed to the legislatures of the several states by the first Congress, September 25, 1789, were ratified by 11 states. That's true, ratified and reported. And the facts of the ratification were communicated to Congress by the President as follows. Maryland, January, so the state took action, they mailed it to the President, he mailed it to the Congress, he sent it next room over at the time, and gave it to the Senate, the House, and to the Secretary of State. At Maryland, January 25, 1790, New Hampshire, February 15, 1790, Delaware, blah, 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 okay? And then it ends with this sentence. This is 125 years ago. There is no evidence of the ratification of these amendments by Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Georgia. Now, I'm going to ask you to look at the date on this book. And what date is this, sir? What date was that published by the Department of State? At the bottom.
1894.
1894. And what does this say? What did the Department of State know in 1894? Read that last sentence, please.
There is no evidence of the ratification of these amendments by Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Georgia.
Pass that around, please. This is a little heavy. And the stories get heavy. Now, one would have thought, just like with Professor Schwartz's reference to a 1963 magazine, that you'd want to see what was enclosed in the letter, one would have thought, like, 100 years in, geez, we have no evidence or information from Georgia, Connecticut, or Massachusetts. Now, you would have thought that someone would have said, gee, did anything take place in Connecticut, Georgia, or Massachusetts? No one checked. Now, in all fairness, in 1894, we didn't even really have telephones, we had telegraphs. You'd have to get on a horseback. Cars were still distant in the future. And communication was not that simple. So I'm not faulting people, but I'm saying, you would have thought they would have been curious. No one checked. And they left it alone, okay? And no one even thought about Kentucky. I'll tell you about Kentucky. Kentucky was the 14th state in the Union. I'm not an advocate for the Kentucky Consumer Affairs Division, but Kentucky was approved for admission as a state in February 1791, approximately the same time that Vermont was approved for admission as a state. However, Vermont was approved for admission as a state effective March 4th, 1791, meaning the day the next Congress started. And for whatever reason, Kentucky, which was known as the District of Kentucky, formerly part of, well, at the time still part of Virginia, had to wait for whatever reason until until June 1st, 1792. So they made Kentucky wait 15 months. So they were both approved in February 1791. Okay? But, for whatever reason, Kentucky had to wait. But Kentucky was still a state. So everyone, forget about that. The Department of State in 1894 is not even asking about Kentucky. So I'm thinking, geez, there's Massachusetts, Georgia, Connecticut, and Kentucky. There's 4 states. Now, according to the popular standard, 11 of 13 is required. Now, I'll give you a quick math lesson. Very, very simple. 3/4 of 13, okay, I'm sorry, 3/4 of 14 is 10.5. Now, is 10.5 11, or is it 10? And who makes that call? Now, before proceeding, I'll tell you something that's going to throw another wrinkle into this whole thing. Thomas Jefferson is on record as viewing 10.5 as 10. He was the Secretary of State. George Washington is on record as, and that's because Thomas Jefferson's theory of numbers was truncation. You know, we're taught in school, if it's 0.5, you round up, you round down. His theory was, if it's a fractional number, until you get to the next hole, you disregard it. And in fact, there's books, to those that are in the know and pay attention, written about Thomas Jefferson and his theories of math. Here's one right here. Only people like me read it. Only people like me would even know how to find it. And I'm not passing this around because this will put you to sleep just by holding it. But it is true nonetheless. It doesn't make it any less true. So, and the reason for that is, in a letter to General Armstrong in Pennsylvania, during the debates, there were 13 states, and Washington said to Armstrong, it should be remembered that, you know, we can amend the Constitution with the affirmative vote of 9 states. Now, 13 states, 3/4 is 9.75. So Washington believed 9.75 because he followed Jefferson's theory, which was truncation. And I'm going to pass around a letter in a minute when I get to that part of the story where Jefferson is on record as saying 10.5 is 10. And then when I found that letter, I'm like, oh my God. Because Jefferson said 10 of 14 is 3/4. And he's on record. And his chart said 10 states ratified Article the First. Now Jefferson, again, not a dumb guy. So is it possible, and it's true, he did, Jefferson believed Article the First was ratified. And if you know the numbers again, once again, basic math, if you realize you have the correct numbers, not the ones Schwartz tells you, the real deal, 6 states had ratified Article the Second. 10 states had ratified Article the First. Why did Thomas Jefferson pick that time to have those amendments, the ratification documents, printed and sent to the states? And I'll tell you why. It's simple math. The process was effectively over, and let me tell you why. Okay? Kentucky was the 15th state. Vermont was the 14th state. Okay? And with 15 states, 3/4 is 11.25. Okay? Let me tell you why he reported at that time and sent out that handout that I passed out. Because he believed 10 of 14 was 3/4. And you had that. Article the First was ratified. The other amendments had 1 in excess. And Article the Second only had 6, with 3 states left to report. Connecticut, Georgia, and Massachusetts. With only 6 states ratifying Article the Second, even if they all ratify, that only gets you to 9. When Kentucky becomes a state, true, Kentucky could ratify, but Kentucky changes the standard from 10.5 to 11.25, which then makes it 11. Which means, if you have the real facts, the reason why Jefferson sent that out when he did is because he knew the process was statistically over. Why did he pick that epic time? Because he knew that Article the Second couldn't be ratified, even if all the other reporting states ratified it. You would still be chasing the one. You couldn't make it. But Article the First was ratified. That's under Jefferson's theory. And it gets worse. It gets worse. Let me cut to the chase. Kentucky officially becomes a state June 1st, 1792. On June 24th, 1792, the Kentucky legislature, I'm going to pass it, don't take my word for it,